All right, hey, welcome back. We're going to talk about chapter 21 here. When we discussed chapter 20 and the development of like the Populist Party or the People's Party, right? I told you that this is one of my favorite chapters, and it is. Without a doubt, the progressives, which we're going to discuss today, are my favorite part of American history. And lots of people enjoy like the Second World War or the Civil War, the Revolution, or whatever. I love the progressives. I love the idea that just random people could get an idea in their head about how to make society better and go out and do it. And so that's what happens during the progressive movement. We look at the Populist Party, it's a political party. The Grange movement, the Farmers Alliance, all end up revolving somehow into politics. The progressives work outside of politics, and eventually they get absorbed into politics, but never an organized political party. So that's what kind of sets them apart. The other thing is the progressives are an urban movement, where the Populist Party is more of a rural thing. And so like the progressives are going to have a larger impact on a bigger impact on a larger number of people quicker than like the Populist Party does. So when we look at the progressives, it's not an individual movement like we talked about. They don't have a common goal. In fact, we've talked a little bit about, I think we talked about Jane Addams in chapter 18 or 19. And she's seen as one of the progressives, right? So she's going to start like this settlement house movement where excuse me, it's late at night here. Lots of wealthy middle class college educated women are going to move to large cities, and they're going to work in these settlement houses trying to provide services to immigrant families to make their lives a little better. So the progressives are going to have a wide range of social and political reformers, and they're going to try to make the nation better. And the movement it's not to create a political party. It's not to give any one person or one group power. It's this idea that you're going, it's this idea that you're going to give power back to the common people. Okay. First group that we always look at when we talk about the progressives are the muckrakers, and these are going to be journalists, and they're going to be seen as this group that's going to go out and they're going to shine the flashlights into the muck, and the muck is just the downside of society. Excuse me. Sorry, it's going to be like the tenement houses, the tenements in New York City, where large groups of immigrants are going to live in very, very poor urban conditions. And Jacob Riss is going to go out and take pictures, and you're actually going to read about that for this chapter. He's going to go out and take these pictures with this new invention called flash photography that's going to allow him to go into dark places and take pictures. Ida Tarbell is going to investigate like Rockefeller. Novelist Upton Sinclair is going to write a book called The Jungle, about the Chicago meatpacking plant. And actually, the book is centered around an immigrant family, and it's a love story. But the passages are so powerful about the immigrants working in the meatpacking plants in Chicago, in like the pickling rooms where the acid is eaten through the fingers of the people that work there, or the mice crawl through the sausage and they get ground up, and people read this and they get sickened. Man, I'm putting myself to sleep. I apologize to everybody else. That just sickens the rest of the community, the rest of the world. It gets published in all these major newspapers. President Theodore Roosevelt's going to read this, and he's going to be called to action because of the publication of The Jungle. You're also going to see some political change come about during this time. You're going to see initiative, which is where people put basically people write up a bill and they present it to Congress or to their local legislature to vote on. You have referendums, which the local government basically writes a bill and decides they don't want to vote on it themselves, and they present it to the people to vote yes or no. You have a recall, which we're seeing out in California right now with the governor, a push to recall. So basically, you get enough signatures on a petition, you can get rid of an elected official, or at least have that election or that elected official put back on the ballot for voting yes or no. Direct primaries, like the presidential primary, that's one everybody's most familiar with, in which we vote for the people that we want to represent us in a certain election. We also have the commission system, in which we have city commissions set up, like so multiple people serving on the city instead of just a mayor deciding that that's going to limit corruption, and city manager systems in which the city commission hires a city manager. So all these are going to do, these two over here on the right hand side are just going to put more people in play in government. And they're not going to necessarily root out corruption, but they're just going to make it a whole lot more expensive. So that's where we are. Okay. First idea, when we look at the progressives, we look at Robert Lafayette. He's from Wisconsin, and he is credited with this idea of the Wisconsin idea, in which he's going to form a very tight knit relationship between the local government or the state government of Wisconsin and the University of Wisconsin, which they're both in Madison. And so the government's going to go out and try to get the best and brightest out of the university and get them to work for the government and solve problems. He comes up with this idea of an income tax, a minimum wage, and the direct election of senators from the state of Wisconsin. All of those things are going to get passed during this time frame. You're going to see a national income tax go into effect. You're going to see a minimum, I believe you're going to see a minimum wage during this time frame, and you're going to see the passage of a constitutional amendment that's going to allow for direct election of senators. We see social justice with the settlement house movement. We talked about Jane Addams down here on the left. She does this in Chicago. She opens a place called Hull House, which basically offers, like, reduced prices for daycare, laundry services, meal services, cultural events where they bring in pictures from art galleries or whatever to brighten the lives of the immigrants that live in this thing, live in the large cities, working in the industrial factories. They offer night classes for people that want to improve their lives, and it's a soft place for people to land. They offer services at an affordable rate for people that need help. They make ready-made meals for women that are working in the factory 8 to 10 hours, 12 hours a day, and so when they get home that night, they don't have to start cooking to feed their family. And so, like, you kind of think of it as fast food, but it's probably more like soups. And it's always going to be soups, to be honest, to feed that many people. But it's going to be a soup. They could go home, they could probably warm it up, they feed their family, have breads and soups, and everybody's happy. And it just makes life easier for everybody. You start to see child labor fall out of vogue. We talked earlier during industrialization, I believe, about the fact that that factories like to hire women and children because they could pay them less. Well, you see national child labor organizations, anti-child labor organizations pop up, basically outlawing all forms of child labor. There's actually a movement in history, one of the histography movements, that argues that this whole idea of this progressive movement is not people trying to make the world better, but it's big business basically trying to stomp down the little guy coming up, because the smaller companies couldn't afford to pay full wages and be competitive with large companies, and so they would employ children at a higher rate than, like, Rockefeller or Carnegie or whatever. And so this I don't know, the triumph of conservatism is the name of the book. I can't remember who wrote it off the top of my head, but basically this gentleman was arguing that large companies were the ones that were pushing for these compulsory child labor laws. Okay, you also have workplace safety come into to play. You have some major tragedies at the workplace. One of these is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which was in New York City. Basically, there's a shirtwaist factory, and we say shirtwaist, just think of like a shirt, like a blouse, like a button-up shirt factory in which there are women that were sewing. And somewhere along the lines, one of the factory foremen was convinced that the women were stealing from the factory. And so they began to lock the exit doors when people were working. If you think of a textile factory, like where people are cutting and sewing, there's lots of fabric. When fabric gets frayed, it can float in the air. Fabric is very, very flammable. And so the air at these factories was very, very flammable. And all of a sudden there was a flash. People are probably smoking inside, right? And you have a huge fire. Well, the fire escapes are pretty rickety at this time, and so it falls off of the building. This factory was on the 7th and 8th story of a building in New York City, and so the fire escape falls over. The doors are locked shut, so people can't get out. There's just one elevator going up and down, and it can't take everybody. Everybody's trying to jam in, and the elevator eventually breaks. And so the fire department shows up, and these women workers are trying to jump down to these nets to be saved from the fire. And it's too big of a fall for those big old-fashioned firemen trampoline looking net kind of things. And so the women are jumping, and it's just ripping the nets from the hands of the firefighters, and they're falling to their death. Other women are just jumping out of the building. And all of this is going to happen on a Saturday afternoon, like right at 5 o'clock, when all of New York is getting off of work on a Saturday. So the rich people are coming into the city for the nightlife. The poor people are leaving their jobs. So you have this intermix of rich and poor, and you hear the fire engines going, right? And so like it's 1900. And there's no cable TV, so everybody's going to follow the sirens to see what's going on, and they're going to see these women jumping to their deaths. And one of the people that's going to see this is a lady by the name of Frances Perkins, and she's going to be very, very motivated to bring about safety reforms into the workplace. You see the temperance movement work, and the book does a pretty good job talking about that, I believe, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. You have a real problem with alcoholism in America during this time frame. You go from a period where one of the biggest concerns was the purity of water. And so people would drink dirty water and they'd get dysentery, they would get sick, and they could die. Well, one of the ways that you can alleviate that is you can ferment the water. And so what people would do is they would brew a very, very weak beer, like 3.2, even weaker, where you could drink quite a bit of it and still be okay. Well, that happens for a while, but then we figure out how we can ferment corn alcohol, and we can make corn liquor, and alcohol becomes basically a substitute for currency in the American West. We talked about the fact in the last lecture that there wasn't a whole lot of paper money or coin money. Well, one of the ways that we trade is through alcohol, because all of a sudden you can take a wagon full of corn, and you can condense that down into a product, an alcohol that people would want, into a couple of cases of glass bottles, and then all of a sudden that becomes a way to barter and to do commerce. And so people go from maybe drinking a 20-ounce glass of 2% beer, 2% alcohol beer with lunch, which was pretty common during that time, to all of a sudden they're drinking 10, 12, 14 ounces of moonshine with lunch, and some people just can't handle their alcohol. That's a ridiculous amount of alcohol to be drinking uh, in the in the mid any time of the day, let alone at lunch. And so, like, there's a serious need for alcohol reform in the United States during this time. Um, and the women's temperance movement is going to work there. They feel like alcohol is leading to child neglect, to child abuse, to spousal abuse, domestic violence, those types of situations. And I think that they were absolutely right during that time frame. You also see radical reform start to work its way into the United States. You see the Socialist Party of the United States with Eugene Debs. Um, when we look at, like, socialism is such a knee-jerk reaction word. Like, when you look at the Socialist Party of America, that's founded by Eugene Debs, it's a union movement to organize the workers of America to work for things like an 8-hour workday, for safe workplace, for workman's comp, those types of things. It's not a situation where um, it's not a Bolshevik type of socialism, or a Bolshevik type of communism that's gonna appear in Russia in the 1917. The Socialist Party of America by Debs is totally something different. You have the International Workers of the World that are organizing, and they're working for better working conditions, and fair pay, and 8-hour work days, and those types of things. Um, and they figured out by this time that the strongest method that any of these workers have, these factory workers have, is the strike. And if they can shut down production, then they can have a place at the bargaining table. You start to see the women's suffrage movement get kicked off during this time frame, a little bit before, with Seneca Falls. As Western states come into the Union, they need a certain number of eligible voters. And so Wyoming becomes the first state to open up its voting to women. Because if they, obviously, if you have adult population of 21 or over, let's just hypothetically say all those people at 21 or over are married. If you go from men only to women only, all of a sudden you have double the number of eligible voters, and you have half as far to go to statehood. You have Alice Paul, who's going to form the National Women's Party, that is going to be more radical than Carrie Chapman Catt, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or Susan B. Anthony. And they really needed to be, honestly, to get the women's vote passed. Susan B. Anthony had been working on it for a long period of time, right? Carrie Catt, they're very passive. They're like, hey, do the right thing, do the right thing, do this thing. How long must we wait for liberty, right? Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, basically, they're like, either give it to us or we're going to take it. They throw hunger strikes. They chain themselves to the gate around the White House. They start to organize women to basically take more and more of an active role in society. And they not only want the vote, but they want equal rights, and they want fair pay, and they want the same rights as men workers, and all of these things. And so when society is presented with this, they're like, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you the vote, and we'll hold off on all that other stuff for a while. And so you can start to see the yin and the yang of political movements here, especially with the women's vote, where typically society doesn't want to be rocked too much. And so they have this situation in which you have the ability to make everybody happy with something like, all right, let's give the vote to women. We should have done it after the Civil War anyway. So, all right, so you can have this in 1920, but you can't have the Equal Rights Amendment until recently, 2018 or whatever, when the final state passed that. You start to see the early movement of civil rights with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, the founding of the NAACP. And I'm going to let the book is going to do a better job with that than I am. So I'm going to let the book have you guys read that. So how's all this going to get political? Well, 1900, you have President McKinley get elected. And McKinley fights a neat little war called the Spanish-American War, in which Theodore Roosevelt forms a unit of like his college playing buddies from Harvard, and they join the army and they go into Cuba, and they have some success on the battlefield, and President Roosevelt basically kind of becomes a little bit of a hero. He was actually Secretary of the Navy before when the war broke out, and he was responsible for the United States seizing the Philippines from Spain. And so Roosevelt kind of shoots to national celebrity, and in 1904, McKinley's assassinated, and Roosevelt gets to become president. He's the youngest serving president at that time. He's the youngest serving president. And so Roosevelt comes into power, and Roosevelt is he's progressive for his time. It's 1904, and we would look at Roosevelt as maybe not as progressive as he would like his image to be. Roosevelt is a racist by modern standards. But he does do a lot of wonderful things in the White House. And to be honest, by 1904, he's probably the most racially cool president we have by that time, right? Roosevelt has a pretty hard life as a child. He suffers from horrible asthma, and he basically trains himself out of asthma. He strengthens his lungs to the point that he defeats asthma. Very outdoorsy. At one point during this early political career, his wife and his mother both die almost on the same day. His wife dies giving birth. His mother dies of I think the yellow fever or something. And so he just he loses it. He moves out to North Dakota, becomes a cattle rancher. And so he develops a love for nature out there. He sees this idea of the government helping the industrial workers as something that's good, like using the power of the presidency to call the bully pulpit for the good. He reads The Jungle, and it's published in the newspapers, and he creates the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act that inspects meats and foods that are shipped over state lines, using the power of the government to do that. And so Roosevelt's really seen as this kind of progressive guy to do this. And so he serves in 2000, he serves as vice president, and then McKinley's assassinated shortly after the election. Roosevelt takes over. Roosevelt wins in 1908, and then in 1912 he decided, boy, am I goofy? I'm wrong on my dates. Roosevelt wins in 2000. Roosevelt gets elected vice president in the election of 1900, and then McKinley's assassinated, and then Roosevelt wins the election of 1904. In 1908, Roosevelt decides he's not going to run, and he handpicks William Taft. Taft has no interest in being president. He loves the law. Actually, after he gets done being president, he goes on and serves in the Supreme Court. He's appointed to the Supreme Court. He's a lawyer. He's not a politician. He strengthens the power of the government. He actually does more trust busting than Roosevelt. Trust is that idea of basically bad business. Roosevelt kind of saw trust as if they're doing good for the economy, he's going to allow them to continue. Taft does not see any trust being good, so he actually gets rid of more trust. But Taft doesn't have the personality that Roosevelt does, and he's not as popular. So then in 1912, Roosevelt steps down. In 1908, Taft becomes president. Roosevelt goes off and he floats the Amazon River. He comes back and he's kind of radicalized. He goes to South America, he goes to Africa, he does some hunting, and he comes back and he was a little bit radical with this idea of land conservation and the square deal and whatever. But he comes back and he is really, really radicalized. And he's going to come up with this idea of new nationalism, which is going to change the face of the Republican Party, where it's going to start to move away from traditional Republican values, that idea of tariffs to protect business and those types of things. And Roosevelt comes up with this idea that he's going to have this new Republican Party be more socially minded. And so, like, in the election of 1912, you see a split of the Republican Party where Taft is going to run. He's going to be the Republican guy. And at the Republican convention, Roosevelt and his supporters show up and they make a big stink of it, and they march out and they form their own party. They call themselves the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party. And they're going to split the Republican vote. And this is going to allow the Democrats to win with Woodrow Wilson, who's going to basically kind of come up with this idea of a new freedom for the United States. Okay, that's all important. However, when we look at political trends, one of the things that people like to do, especially in the last 4 years or maybe more, is look at the South's willingness to vote Democrat. And so you have this idea of a Southern Democrat, right? And the Southern Democrat, as an institution of racism, is very, very real up until this time of 1912. When Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican Party, you start to see this new political realignment that's going to develop. And so by the time we get to from 1912 to 20 years later in 1932, you're going to see the Republicans move away from tariffs and protectionism of American industry to this party of free trade, no tariffs, globalization of the marketplace, globalization for large American businesses to ship goods out, right? You're going to start to see the Democrats by 1932 shift from a party that was all about small agrarian farms and upholding social institutions such as slavery or the Jim Crow South after Reconstruction, to a party that's going to start to use the power of the government to step in and hopefully make people's lives better. And so it's not by coincidence that Theodore Roosevelt starts this with the Progressive Party and then leaves the Republican Party. And then his distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, becomes the Democratic president in 1932 and presents the New Deal and leads America out of the Depression and into the Second World War. Okay, Wilson is very progressive in his own right, comes up with this idea of the Federal Reserve System, in which he's going to provide money to banks to increase the money supply in the United States. The other thing that we have not talked about is the fact that America buys Alaska from Russia during this time with the progressives and all of that. And they end up with this whole treasure trove of gold that comes into the American system and solves a lot of economic problems. We also kind of gloss over a couple economic depressions, but whatever. So we have the Federal Reserve System that creates a way for banks to get money. Wilson starts to lower tariffs. We see the passage of the 16th Amendment, which is national income tax. He strengthens investigation and dismantling powers of the federal government, looking into trust and illegal business activities. And that's where we're going to stop right there with Wilson. Wilson's also the first president and the only president to have a doctorate degree in political science. So the study of politics, Wilson is going to be the only gentleman to serve in the presidency with a PhD in political science. A little Jeopardy question there to end chapter 21. This is what the start of our third unit. So hopefully that'll get us there, and we're going to move into America and World War I here very shortly. So thanks for watching. Hopefully this helps to add some depth to the chapter reading, and we'll see you in chapter 22.